Well, it's March the 9th, and I had a topic today I've been thinking about for some time, but I haven't really got into. It's be very controversial, but hey, that's where I operate in. The question I have about this coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, and an aspect of it hasn't been discussed a whole lot. People have kind of hinted at it, but it seems pretty clear-cut that the virus originated in a laboratory in Wuhan, China. Okay, at least that's the general thought, that it somehow got out of the lab either by mischance or something, and that it spread throughout Wuhan, and then eventually, of course, the Chinese allowed it to be sent all over the world while they were able to contain it within their own country, apparently. Now, so there's some real paradox here in this situation. Let's look at it this way. Right now, as I've got the numbers here, China has 101,170 reported cases, compared to the United States is over 29 million cases, even though China has a population of more than 4 times the United States. Then we look at other characteristics. It's also spread rapidly throughout Europe with similar levels as we have in the United States and other countries. But where you find it, and of course there's probably some countries that simply have deficient healthcare systems that just don't have the reporting. We get into, say, what you might call more what traditionally was called the third world areas. Not that it isn't there. It may be partly because the people there don't travel as much, or have as much exposure to foreigners initially, and also just because I suppose it just didn't get reported as much because they don't have the established healthcare reporting systems. But the thing is, this is so strange. But then we see another pattern. We look at other countries that are similar to the Chinese in some ways, such as South Korea, which has more per capita by far than China, but still creeping up toward 100,000. Or Japan, which I think is a little over 400 and some thousand now. Let me check real quick here. It's about 441,000 cases. And so what we're kind of looking at in this situation is, could this be could this be actual biowarfare? Genetically engineered virus. I throw this out because let's look at the situation that occurred and its effects. As we went into 2000, the United States had a very strong economy, and President Trump had survived the faux impeachment attempt that the Democrats perpetrated, and seemed to be about to gain popularity to the highest levels of his administration. All these fake attacks that had been put on him were pretty much behind him, and his policy basically to fight back against the Chinese encroachment economically, the trade war, so to speak, was now moving in his favor. And the Chinese long-term goal, of course, is world economic dominance. So perhaps this thing was actually unleashed, seeing that this trend was happening, was unleashed in Wuhan as a cover story in order to generate a certain amount of cases, and then allow it to spread throughout the world while somehow carefully containing it in China. But it's also interesting that it doesn't seem to affect the East Asian populations as much as everybody else in the world. And that's why I'm wondering, is it possible that there was some genetic marker that was used to prevent mass infection there? There is some infection in Japan, for over 400,000 cases. There's approaching 90-some thousand cases in South Korea. Even when you look at the freer areas of China where you would say, well, the reporting would be probably better like Hong Kong, well, it's under PRC control, but it's a lot more information comes out of Hong Kong than comes out of other parts of China, I would say. And it's still relatively low there, too. And that's a very dense area. Then look at, say, Israel, the horrible amount of infection they had there. I mean, it just seems to me that somehow that this thing could have been genetically engineered so that it wouldn't be that devastating to the Chinese population. and would be selectively more, they probably didn't care much about what happened to anybody else, and the wider it spread, the better, because it would kind of deflect attention from them in China. And so what did that do? Well, that obviously, one clear outcome of this pandemic has been the election of Joe Biden as president, obviously. I mean, Joe Biden would have had a very little chance of defeating Trump without COVID, because basically, let's face it, he is incapable of waging a robust campaign. And without COVID, there'd be no excuse not to. That's a very simple aspect of it. I mean, you can talk about like what people thought about the way Trump was handling or what he said about it and all that stuff. Far more significant was the direct effect it had on him. Add to the fact, of course, that coincidentally, Trump lost a debate out of this thing because he came down with it and was put off the campaign trail for 2 weeks when he was infected himself. Now, that was a bonus that the Chinese couldn't have counted on. That's like a little bit of good luck on their part, I'm sure. But the point, nonetheless, is that the COVID has damaged the Western economies and has left the Chinese economy essentially intact. Now, we can figure that some of the Chinese numbers are probably deceptive. What if, in fact, they're only maybe 10 times what they're claiming? But still, it does seem there's no evidence that they're really in any kind of condition like they were, like things are in the Western world, for instance. There is no real global lockdown of the Chinese economy going on due to this thing. So, although they may be not being frank with us about the exact numbers, and there are some signatures of those numbers that suggest, in fact, that maybe they're not exactly correct. For instance, the fatality rate is about over twice what the U.S. fatality rate is. Of course, that again, maybe the Chinese treatment wasn't as good, and according to their statistics, it was early before treatment techniques had been developed at all anyhow. Who knows? My point is, even if you assume that they're off by a factor of 10 or 20 in their honesty, still, percentage-wise, the damage to the Chinese economy is tremendously less than the U.S. and Western European economies. And in fact, it doesn't look like it did that much damage to Japan, really. And not that they were trying to be preferable. I just think as a consequence of this genetic selectiveness that I've suggested, if that was what was done, that could explain why it coincidentally, countries that were genetically similar to the Chinese population in certain markers probably weren't as badly affected as people that are completely different. But it does seem like almost all the other people of the world are pretty highly affected by it. And so there are areas where, for instance, some people talk about Africa, but again, you have a younger population in Africa, which is, again, less impacted even here. And certainly, so all in all, I think this is just an interesting theory, and it seems like nobody wants to touch this with a 10-foot pole, as the saying goes. But this may be what has happened to us. I just want to throw this out as a possibility. I don't think there's any proof of this, but it is interesting that the scientists at this Wuhan lab were, for instance, going into caves with exotic bats, trying to collect really weird viruses and stuff. And that's the kind of thing you see biowarfare projects sometimes wanting to do too, And for instance, the United States abandoned its offensive biowar projects back in, I think, 1969. And so, but the Chinese, the genetic technologies are so much more advanced now that things that would have been impossible back in the time that we, what were anthrax or something was our idea of a really potent, weapon. Perhaps, technologies have advanced a lot. These new genetic technologies that, for instance, are being used to create vaccines on a record rate, of which we now have available. The same sort of technologies might be able to be used for another purpose, and perhaps that's what was done. Anyway, I just want to throw this out for people's consideration. I'm not claiming it's true. I'm simply saying it's something that should be considered more carefully, I think. Anyway, if you like these videos, please subscribe. You can hit the bell to get notified when the new ones come out, and of course, forward to people that might be interested. All for now.